Holiday friends, Guahusi Manny Cruz, Dr. Manny Cruz, your host. This is the first ever episode of Matå'pang's Canoe Club. This is an exclusive for Fanatsu patrons. I'm so glad that C. Maget asked me to come back to Fanatsu. It's been a long time coming. Of course, I've made a few guest appearances here and there over the past 2 years as I was completing my PhD, but I'm back in Guahan and back here on Fanatsu. And so I guess I'll start by kind of explaining the name and the sort of the vision for Matå'pang's Canoe Club. So Matå'pang's Canoe obviously is a reference to Vince Diaz's work in the wake of Matå'pang's Canoe, which came out in 2016, I believe. His work was, or is still, so inspirational. And with this reading in particular, I remember reading it in the newsroom of the Guam Daily Post. I was a reporter there. And the work inspired me in that presented a regional, dare I say, universal field of reference for analysis taking place in the Marianas, in Guahan, and for who we are as a people, as Timoru people. Diaz goes on to compare the name, the person, Matå'pang, and the word Matå'pang to its lexical relatives, I guess you would say, in the Philippines and in other parts of the Pacific. And for that reason in particular, I would say, but this was at a point where I was exploring all of these different PhD programs and really questioning, what I was going to do for the next couple of years, what type of research I would embark on, and where I would do such research. There's just so many layers to the work that he does. And so, the last part of this title, Matå'pang's Canoe Club, is sort of a play on the idea of Guahan and the Pacific as some sort of tropical paradise. We obviously have entities like yacht clubs and all sorts of other country clubs, golf clubs, things that are for the prestigious elite in our community. And so this is sort of a jab at that idea, in opposition to those things. What is Matå'pang's Canoe Club other than a place or space for people to be critical of capitalism and other forms of oppression, to do so collectively, as a club and as a podcast, I guess, or a segment of the larger Fanatsu. I guess I plan to open this up to the many friends out there in Guahan and around the world that we have who are connected to Guahan and who can share in some insights into systems of oppression, how they're challenging these things, and how we can overcome collectively as indigenous peoples and allies. And so, as is customary with our culture, in order to move forward and go forth with Matå'pang's Canoe Club, I felt like a very important step was to first look at where we are embarking from. And so I reached out to Vince Diaz and I asked him if he would like to talk a little bit about his work. It's been quite a few years since he published In the Wake of Matå'pang's Canoe. And so I wanted to see if he'd had any developing thoughts or ideas around the work that he published then. How have those things changed now? How are they still relevant now? And also, in particular with Matå'pang's Canoe Club, where he, as sort of a founding scholar in critical indigenous studies, would like to see the show progress, how he would like to see the show progress. And so please enjoy this interview I recorded with him. As with all of these things, I am figuring this thing out as we go along, and I can't wait to hold many more episodes and conversations with lots of interesting and insightful guests. And that's it. Hasta. Other people out there. And so I wanted to, I guess with this, what will be the first episode, I wanted to talk to you about your chapter. You know, it was published in 2016, if I remember correctly. And so I wanted to know if you had any thoughts. Are there any thoughts that you've revisited, you know, since then? And
thank you. So several things. I'm still. I learned something about words like Matå'pang that linguists actually knew already, and I just learned this very recently. And my first response was a little anxiety because, you know, this. First of all, there's a word for such words, and it's common enough. And the word is contronyms. But there's words out there that actually have diametrically opposite meanings. The same word can mean the exact opposite thing. And you know, I felt a little bit of deflation because I thought, fuck, that's just something that's everywhere, you know. And then I kind of pinned on that this not a grand theory, but you know, a claim that I don't think is original. Certainly a lot of people think about it, but a claim about discursive flourish, that and the political possibilities of discursive flourish in the context of like a Catholic colonial mission story that can be understood as trying to arrest meaning or contain it, and or this tyranny to control meaning, where in a larger frame, a term that we always thought was exclusively Chamorro, and it still may be, has these cognates that are pretty clear. They have some relationship to each other, and it's striking that on at least 3 registers, we find in at least 6 dialects something and its opposite on 3 registers, like purity, water, taste, you know, character, you know, bold and strong versus cowardly, or, you know, that kind of stuff. And we know that that at least in certain critical traditions, the world lies in language, and power lies in language. The power of narrative, the discourse, for example, is a material thing. It's not just a conceptual thing. And I think Indigenous people understand that. And people understand that why it's utterly important to reclaim one's language from colonialism. And this was a term that doesn't, for any range of meanings, doesn't erase the specific meanings that are found here on Guam among Chamorros, whether it's that itself has the range. You know, it's from a hero to a villain. That for a lot of people, Matå'pang is a historical figure that's been reviled or lionized, right? So the fact that you have cognates actually shouldn't surprise us, because we know historically and culturally and politically, Chamorro language is a member of a larger branch. And we know that there's a lot of other terms that are Chamorro but are found across what's now called Austronesia. And I'm certain that if we were to do a more intensive investigation, we'll find variations of Matå'pang in Indonesia, probably all the way up to Madagascar. And then it won't be hard to also find the cognates as they evolve slightly differently in the Caroline Islands and Polynesia. I don't, so, and then I wouldn't even be surprised if there we found even more different registers that it signifies that could also be this or that, or neither this nor that, nor, so I laid that all out. But to find out that that this thing called contronyms, and there's a part of me that felt like, was I overreading? Am I making a big thing over what's, well, I subsequently decided that no, so it's a contronym, and contronyms exist, and Chamorro, no people are so exceptionally different than any other people in language play and the power of language and all of that kind of stuff. So I got rid of that. So I bring that up because sure as it made me feel that there's still something here, but it could be even found all over the place, so that maybe that might question the claim about, I also made a larger claim that this is a character of indigeneity. Indigenous people thrive on discursive flourish. And maybe this is one of the ways that we're still here, that even not only in our vernaculars, but how we pick up and play with colonial languages, we do so in ways that deflect or subvert semantical tyranny. That's not, in this, I draw from Vince Rafael's work, Filipino historian and critic who very early on drew from post-colonial criticism and radical critique to think differently about decolonization and power, but from the vantage point of language and discourse. So I hope I attribute that critical sensibility to him. But the point I'm trying to make now here with respect to what you're trying to do, I think, is this. So though I wrote the article and I stick my neck out to hazard an interpretation that is that sort of draws from a history of cognates, a history of migration, and the canoe, and actually also zoom in on certain things about Matå'pang, the historical figure, and what took place on his canoe, which I think has not been really treated, not only not really thought about by historians, but actually one can make the argument that the narratives about Matå'pang vis-a-vis Salvatoris and the valorization of Salvatoris' death and the villainization of Matå'pang on land sort of is also a kind of metaphor or allegory to how this indigenous political history, as seen from a canoe, has been marginalized. And so I try to make a case for actually a kind of realistic reading about what actually happened in Matå'pang's canoe that might subvert or challenge what's supposed to be the firm histories based on the narratives that supposedly took place on the beach. And that narrative for the Catholic part of the story is, of course, the martyrdom of Salvatore at the hands of the evil villain Matå'pang, right? And so, but I'm not going to rehearse what I tried to do with all that, except to say that for whatever I wrote, whatever my interpretation is, the last thing I will try to say is that I'm right, and this is the only way you have to look at it, you know? And so Matå'pang's canoe, I would say, is actually up for grabs. You know, we can play with that image of Salvatore's hand reaching to grab the canoe. It's up for grabs, except not anything goes. And what you got to do is to mix metaphors, to anchor whatever you do with the idea of the radical possibilities of not just canoe culture, which to me stands for also for seafaring possibility. You know, I also write about seafaring's radical possibilities for decolonization and stuff like that. So when we talk about canoe, we're talking about a portal and a very capacious platform. For us in Micronesia, it's the fact, to me, the transformative fact has been transformative for me early on. The fact that it's in Micronesia that we and all of the Pacific and anybody else can actually really begin to understand a radically different way of being in and from an island. I think, for example, that canoe culture traditionally gives us insight into what people are calling radical relationalities, different ways of thinking about time, space. I've written about how just a couple of things in seafaring already implode ideas about islandness and history and stuff like that. So the idea of canoes as a platform for not just recovering indigenous stuff, but also for imagining radical futures, radical forms of critique in very substantive ways. Very, very, like, to really know how people were able to navigate long distances through their embodied relationship with local knowledge. That's steeped in technology and technique, and there's a science and more. So anybody who knows my work knows that I've been passionate about what it is, what's transformative about canoe culture in particular. Whatever one wants to do with canoe culture and what it stands for, we have to, I think, it has to be open enough to account for this tension in seafaring between deep rootedness to a place that's your home, that is the basis for understanding who you are in relation to the world around you, that then becomes the material and the condition for pushing past those horizons. That's routes, reaching out. traditional seafaring, one of traditional seafaring history and discourse and practice's most radical legacy, I think, for us, and lesson for us, is that to talk about, and I say this in many different ways, to talk about powerful, deep, strong roots to a place and the radical relationalities of kinship and reciprocity that comes out of that depth of knowing the place around you, is also the condition and the material for expanding your world. So roots and routes are not mutually exclusive. Traditional seafaring, long before there was Europe, long before modern science and all that stuff, traditional seafaring showed us that deep commitment to a specific place, the classical tropes of indigeneity, and moving effectively and far are not mutually exclusive. And you can look at these in different registers. What you think is a definitive meaning about one thing can also be understood as the condition and material for taking that meaning farther out. So I'm reading Emalani Case's book, Everything Ancient Was Once New. Emily was a student of Teresia at UVic in Wellington. Her book just came out. And her book is about kahiki, the idea of the ancient homeland. And in 5 chapters, she says kahiki and this, kahiki and this. And she looks at 5 different registers and gives us a very deep, grounded, evidence-based rereading of kahiki that constantly in 5 different registers in the question of resurgence, in the question of hope, in the question of courage, and in different registers, kahiki continuously is a concept, a discourse, a practice, an ontology that is about steepedness in a specific place and the possibility of radically different futures together. So there's no semantic tyranny without losing the depth of indigenous meanings. So whatever you do with the canoe in the way that we understand it, the way that I understand it, or the way that I understand it in terms of this kind of icon or allegory of critical indigeneity, is that you can't contain it, and you should not contain it. But it doesn't mean anything goes. You still have to keep close to what you know of the meanings of the canoe within your vernacular, within your tradition, within your and one of the most intriguing, interesting things in Emalani's book is she's actually one who does a move that I don't see often in critical indigenous studies, and that is for all of her resolve to be right there with the resurgence up at the Mauna Kea, or she writes off a lot about her solidarity with Ihu Matau in Auckland. Her sense of self-determination and sovereignty, that is right up there with the most radical and staunch of the sovereignty people, the Lahui people in Hawaii. For all of that, she's also willing to look at the deep contradictions within in the discourses of, in this case, Kahiki, and check all of her energies and convictions about Hawaiian self-determination in the face of clear histories where different Hawaiians at different times drew from their ancestral knowledge to make sense of contradictions of their times, even if at different moments what they said of it totally undermines what the 21st century nationalist movement would like to see as the political future. She's actually calling Indigenous people to be brave enough to face those kinds of contradictions openly, engage them because they will, whether you like it or not, they are records of your ancestors dealing with things with the material that they knew of their histories. And so there's a moment in this one moment where she explores changing ideas of kahiki in the historical record in Hawaiian. You'll see alternating, clashing ideas about the definition of kahiki and certain traditions, even to the point at one point clearly showing the influence of missionaries, the emergence of those who would invoke kahiki in a certain prophecy to legitimize the influence of Christianity. That prophecy was actually about God, and the need to convert. And she has a very more nuanced argument about that. But at some point around the time of the overthrow, you also had what we don't hear about often, and that's Hawaiians who rallied and organized themselves in support of annexation. And they also invoked deep tradition and prophecies that a generation earlier had people legitimizing their point of view, as well as people who were legitimizing a criticism of these missionaries. So it's not as if, one of the things that I think is coming out of the reading of the book, it's not as if one's deep ancestral, deep indigenous tradition simply gives you a self-evident take on what you're supposed to be and what indigeneity is about. In fact, indigeneity's, one might say, indigenity's most powerful weapon is the fact that it refuses to be a singular thing for all time. And she basically tells the story of Kahiki, this mythical homeland that is not just an imaginary place. So if we were to think about the canoe like that, the canoe is at once made possible by deep tradition and knowledge about place, which in the Pacific is the relationship between land, sky, and water, and personhood in relation to that. And how that has been instrumentalized into the conditions for travel as well. That's the ingenuity of seafaring, that it is at once deep roots to a place that is instrumentalized into the possibilities for shooting past the horizon. And you could think about that metaphorically as well as geographically.
Yeah, I
So
mean, you have that line in there where you talk about it's basically in so many words, why stop at Oceania when ours is the universe,
yeah.
essentially, right?
So one of the things I like about seafaring in Micronesia is that it gives us definitions of islands that begin from the ocean floor. It includes currents to the surface of the water, but then it goes on to include winds, and then clouds, and then the skies, and then the cosmos, and to take stock of indigeneity or indigenous ideas about islands. You have to be able you have to be uh, adroit and quick on your feet, and um, uh, what's the word I'm looking for? You need to be agile enough to shift scales from the personal to the historic to the political to uh, the material, earthly around you, to the moment when it's cosmic. You know, indigeneity is constantly shifting registers. And that's actually one of the things that has made it so a real pain in the ass for colonialism, because it refuses to be contained. And so it makes you think about how colonialism is a process of it's a carceral logic. It's a process of holding the name down in time and space so that it gets to have the monopoly over travel. And it gets to have the monopoly over travel to tell its own story of its own roots and privilege that, you know. So in that sense, if we reduce it to these figures like that, indigeneity is the biggest impediment to modern European self that anchors itself on notions of private property ownership and possession and things like that. You know, and natives were you know, if they were just part of nature, that's one thing, but how they're part of nature, the relationship that they have with nature. And one of the more interesting moments in Emalani's book is when she returns to that trope of the native one with nature, problematizes that, but also comes back and says, but there's a truth to that, and it's in these relations of kinship and reciprocity that and making good on that is actually the way that we should understand what it means to be a human. And that's a very radically different, whole different system than the one that has individuals as having dominion over the world, and the terms of that dominion is private and public property and ownership and self, and everything else is resource to be extracted and instrumentalized for the exclusive enjoyment and benefit of not just humans, but you know, in the fiction that they tell of themselves, all humans, except we know that only 1% really enjoys that, you know. And if you're not white, or you're not straight, or you know, you kind of like yeah, you kind of have to shed that if you want to be a full-on member as well. So, but I'll get back to the idea that, you know, as much as I appreciate you, and I'm tickled by what you see as something of value and something that I wrote, I really feel that, you know, I only own Matå'pang's Canoe to the extent that I might offer something interesting in the retelling of that, and not to disavow the what I make of it. But I don't own that. That's not mine. I don't think anything I actually have to say you have to follow at all. You know, I don't own canoes, and I don't know really what my stakes are with Matå'pang, whether it's Chamorro or Matå'pang or that kind of stuff. Um, but it's something that bears kinship with the critical sensibilities I have that come from a sense of also not so much entitlement, but birthright and kinship and relationality with canoes as both a Carolinian from the diaspora and as a Filipino from the diaspora as well, born and raised on Guam and nurtured on and coming to age in a moment when Chamorros are expressing self-determination and sovereignty, you know. But if you were to ask me, you know, what are some of the key takeaways of Matå'pang's Canoe, and the wake of Matå'pang's Canoe in particular, because wake is also a technical thing in canoes. The displacement of water is a function of speed and current conditions, surface and underwater current conditions, and the design of your hull. This is some of the technical aspects, and it's the ability to and wake the displacement of water as you're moving, the amount of water that's displaced, how much and how it is also one of the things that trained navigators can sense and calculate for a sense of how fast you're going or how much resistance is coming from the elements, whether it's the wind or currents or swell or, you know, any number of things. And so a wake is a very technical term that traditional navigators and canoe builders were very cognizant of, and were constantly innovating their craft to perform and building their craft of knowledge to be able to use, because you can't know how far you've gone from a place without knowing how fast you're going, without all that kind of stuff. And so you needed a way to tell time and distance. And ATAC, this idea of moving islands, is the way that they came up with. It's their timepiece, you know, so a wake is part of how one tells how fast one is moving. It's a fundamental part of knowing, of being able to figure out where you are at any given point from your island or to wherever else you want to go. And seafaring, traditional seafaring, is that system was made possible by those kinds of technological discoveries and perfection or innovation and improvement, because the story's not over, that offers a radically different way than cartography or timekeeping in the West. You know, so then there's also a different connotation of wake that has to do with bereavement and funerals. And so in the wake of Matå'pang's Canoe is also a sort of, you know, bid to get past the obsession of this idea of there's a very particular and peculiar cluster ideas about the idea of who and what needs to die so that someone must live. In the Catholic story, Jesus is the supreme example of martyrdom. It's writ as a story of love, that he gives his life so that you might live in heaven. You follow him to heaven. And that story is replicated in the historiography of Guam, in the sense that, it's kind of sad, but don't mourn, because the death of Chamorros was the possibility of their salvation and civilization, But it also leaves you with this idea that others have lamented and blasted Catholicism and the Spanish conquistadors when they say that, that story of Catholicism among Chamorros has been nothing but the death of authentic native culture. But we know that for whatever difficulties we might have with the conversion story and the mission story, you can't say Chamorros died, don't exist anymore, as, there was a lot of transformation, but we also have to leave room for the possibility, like Emalani said, that, maybe your ancestors did things that followed what they thought to be indigenous that you may not agree with today, and I think most people who look at histories of indigenous conversion to Christianity no longer simply accept that was simply a story of what outsiders did to natives. People have recognized already that indigenous people, whether you like it or not, also did something of their own for their own interests with indigeneity. And repositioning the missionary was my attempt to begin from that premise, that the story of the mission, far from being the end of real Chamorro culture, was really the start of an ongoing story whereby for a whole variety of reasons and motives, including compulsion and force, Chamorros also did something to that for themselves, and there's a politics around that, and there's a set of issues that we have to really contend with, rather than simply resort to flat stereotypical stories that are packed in their definition. The idea of the wake of Matå'pang's canoe is also a story of how to keep open-ended, those stories of when you're lamenting or what you're grieving. Did they really die? That whole kind of thing too. So there's a lot of stuff there, but really, I tried to present a story of Canoe and of Matå'pang within a story of the spread of Austronesian languages, and this interesting set of meanings and their divergences, or the diametrical opposites, and try to present it as not a story of binaries or either or mutual exclusions, but certainly dualities that might be not diametrical opposite, but are a range of possibilities between two extreme possibilities, this or that, or neither this nor that, or anything in between. The possibility that a term can hold such what might be initially dismissed as illogical or impossibility. If you say something is A, then you cannot say that it is not A, because then you just undermined any validity of the first statement, this is A. But Matå'pang is one of these terms that on 3 different registers says it's A and not A at the same time, and along with a number of other different things. And so, I was interested in the radical possibilities of that. In no case did it say it had no meaning. And anybody who wants to really privilege one meaning over another will be able to give solid evidence for that. But I'm not talking about a free-for-all relativism, not at all. So, I think for better or for worse, what I like about Matå'pang's Canoe is that it could be like a site or a platform for going to those issues that are particularly paradoxical or contradictory, but not shy away from them because of that, or messy, Chamorro Catholicism, Chamorro Americanism, right? Like, fuck that. That's how I feel. Fuck that. But I'm not ready to tell like your grandfather that he's wrong. That's so fucking arrogant. I mean, who am I to say that? And who are, well, there's good answers, and the future of Chamorro indigeneity is gonna have. If you all don't take on those contradictions and messy stuff, someone else is going to, or you're going to be, I always thought that the real strength of post-colonial criticism was that that it braved it after decades of independence, in the wake of independence and nationalism, of kicking out the white guys. There were critics who actually had the courage or the balls to say, what the fuck, things are even worse. It didn't deliver. Independence and nationalism and our own nation. Maybe there's residuals in that system called colonialism that seeped in there, and it inhabited how we innocently thought about our subjectivities, or how we thought about history, the romanticized idea of history. That maybe if just the workers united or the peasants united, then it's going to deliver the goodies once and for all. But nobody's delivered that. No. Post-colonial criticism, far from being what a lot of people think is something to aspire to, no more colonialism. The critique of post-colonialism was actually instead a charge to take stock of the inequalities and the subjugations that have lingered in the wake of nationalist liberation. Just because we kicked out the colonizer and maybe there was something wrong with, maybe we naively thought that the nation was an innocent thing, that if we just took over it, it'll be good. But post-colonial criticism is one of the first ones to put on the table how colonialism operated through as a very gendered thing. Decolonization didn't account for patriarchy. Maybe patriarchy is lots colonial, but maybe not only colonial. Or maybe, you know what I mean? But now we also have to take stock of sexuality and religiosity and all these kinds of stuff. That's not, so colonialism is actually possibly more complicated than we thought. That's how I learned what post-colonialism, post-colonial critique was about. Now, one of the problems with that was that it also developed a very deep distrust about nativism. But this is one of the reasons why I think Native studies doesn't use the term nativism as its rah-rah cry. I mean, we're at a moment where we realize that nativism is what white folks do in appropriating, is playing Indian. And that indigeneity, maybe that one we can develop as an analytic to take stock of where post-colonialism might have thrown the baby out with the bathwater, you know. But post-colonial anthropology, for example, from South Asia and from Asia and from Africa, went at great lengths to show how, among other things, colonialism operated by the way anthropologists theorized nativeness and culture. And so what does that mean for us who want to decolonize but still maintain anthropological notions of culture? You know, I think, for example, the work I do and how I think about navigation and canoe culture, there's tons of anthropologists who like study canoe culture and canoe building and all that kind of stuff, and they talk at great lengths and they act like experts, Orientalist experts and all that kind of stuff. And I just don't see the stakes in canoes for me. It's just not that. I don't feel like I'm an ethnographer of canoe culture. You know, that's because I've developed a strong distrust of anthropological definitions of culture and nativeness and stuff like that. You know, I'd rather look to canoe culture to redefine what we mean by culture and how we understand nativeness, rather than, you know, that kind of stuff. So you know, I think that the canoe is a very capacious thing. In one hand, it's like a tool that depends on what you do with it. On the other hand, I also know, and this is the bid to not let anything go, not make it so that anybody who's into canoes has equal stakes in what you want to say about canoes. You know, anybody who wants to interpret what Matå'pang is, it's on the same plane as you guys. You know, I don't think we're positioned. You know, so if I were to revert or to go, my go-to is what I understand about canoe culture, canoe practice, canoe discourse. I also, when I study canoes, the materiality of the canoe, what those guys from Pulawat say about it, not that they're the only experts, but I do privilege them because it's still an organic part of what they do. And you know, miraculously, they continue doing this thing despite these centuries of colonialism. And we're lucky that they have that. Those of us who lost track of that, you know. I'm sure you know, you've seen in New Zealand how robust Maori waka culture is, and their work on indigenous astronomy, and you know, all of that renaissance and recovery of deep knowledge that stems from Polynesian voyaging revival, and we all know how indebted all of that is to practitioners from the Central Carolines, Matå'pang Island, right? And for me, what I discovered is actually as a result of their stories, that Polynesian revival, they've kind of shortchanged a more robust story in Micronesia that you know, Mao was just not the only navigator. And a lot of what he said wasn't exactly true. He justified working with the Hawaiians by saying a younger generation of Micronesians no longer interested in seafaring. But that just wasn't true at all. So maybe for who he knew in Sarawak, but Polawat folks, they're still generating young folks that are skilled and eager to learn and all of that kind of stuff, you know. So, but to get back to the point of the canoe, when I think about the canoe itself, the material object as it's been put together, as it is an object that that in their discourses still contains the manama. That's the Carolinian version of mana, the mana of a tree, and all of the relations to a specific tree, the kinship relations, literally the clan that owns access to that tree and whatever mana they have. That gets transferred onto the canoe through ritual prayers and stuff like that, so that the canoe is no longer just an object. The canoe is a living, sentient being. So you got to honor that. You got to respect that. You got to understand what that is. Because if you don't, that canoe could get you killed out in the ocean. You know, disrespect that canoe and see what happens, right? Go out in the water and disrespect the water and see what happens, right? Chamorros know better than to yell and be disrespectful when they're out fishing. That you just don't do that. You don't act obnoxiously because you know how powerful the water is, right? And the water has an agency, and you know, and spirits live there. Those relationalities. So, you know, a canoe demands that you know it and you respect it and you respect where it comes from, enough to not just say what you want about it. You know, and so that's one of the ways that you anchor the idea that not just anything goes. There's an indigenous deep tradition that one needs to know about canoes in general and specific canoes in particular, the history of that canoe, who built it, why, all of those kinds of things. You know, so you know, Matå'pang's canoe could be launched as in the spirit of reclaiming the full richness and the contradictions of what we know about Matå'pang, the historical figure, and possibly doing respect to what has been said about his canoe. You know, I just think that that scene around the idea of Salvatore still being alive, and the possibility that he actually died out at sea when he was, I gave I hazarded an interpretation, you know, but like, what does it really mean that you know, he actually met his death out in the water trying to get back on Matå'pang's canoe? What does it mean that that reality is totally obscured by the preferred narrative of Salvatore's heroic death on land and the burning of his blood and all of that kind of stuff that we know is a central part of the telling of a glorious story of the missionaries as, you know, saving heathens, and the kinds of stories that come on the heels of that or on the wake of that. I think, for example, I've argued that the telling of the story of Salvatores and Matå'pang set into play pretty much the same terms that would be used to understand Americanization. You know, and the binaries that come with that. And so in the same way that Guam's history has been structured as either a celebration of the missionaries or a demonization of the missionaries, but in either case, Chamorros as natives had to die, you know, to lionize the mission story or to damn it. You know, it was almost like a foregone conclusion by critics of the mission story that Chamorros died. These damn missionaries killed off all the Chamorros. And the only Chamorros that are left are just Christians, his Latino peasants who, you know, I mean, people actually said that, you know. Where was I? So there's a whole narrative rooted in the particular story of Salvatore's death at the hands of Matå'pang there at the beach, that is very firm about, I mean, it's so the church is so firm about its veracity that it's willing to say that you know, he's on his way to sainthood, and there's an element in the church that still argues that the church's pronunciation of someone as being a saint is fits under the banner of papal infallibility, meaning that it was not a declaration by man, but God through the church, right? You know, but the story of Salvatore might have been a very different thing, and it might be possible that the reality of what happened in the canoe might make the difference. You know, maybe they fucking went fishing together.
You never know,
And,
yeah.
You know what I mean? Or maybe Salvatore was gay or something, what we would call gay today, made an advancement, or maybe Matå'pang made an advancement, or, you know, not like, I'm never going to say this.
Yeah.
You won't get me to say it.
Mm.
And I just said it and you recorded it.
Well, you know,
I'm not saying that, like, you know,
all in good faith, yeah.
If you're listening to this, I didn't mean to be disrespectful or sacrilegious, you know, because I know how invested people are on either Salvatore or Matå'pang. Matå'pang as either a hero or as a villain. I mean, there's still people who are vested in that for how they understand their indigeneity, right? When I interviewed Polly Scott did not like, he really thought Matå'pang was a coward and he should not be a hero. You know, he said something to me. He said the guy didn't even have the guts to kill Salvatore himself. He has to recruit a friend, you know. And I'm like, whoa, you know, this is, you know, you're really old school, because like even the, you know, he I didn't say this to him, you know, but, you know, and I was interviewing him in 1990 or 89 or 88. The Council of Catholic Bishops in the Philippines themselves apologized to Filipinos for the role that the Catholic Church played in the conquest of the Filipinos, you know. And here was the Catholic Church in Guam, actually Archbishop Aparon went to Spain and apologized to the Spanish king for Matå'pang killing Salvatore. You know, it's like, what the fuck is that about, you know? Well, we know what that's about. That there's a story of investing in Catholicism for maybe just for survival, you know. And I made an argument in the book that, you know, maybe paradoxically, one of the ways that Chamorros were able to survive to get the priest off their fucking back is to make the sign of the cross. And then later in time, when they were no longer under assault, you know, earthquakes and typhoons and pestilence maybe gave this a little more charge, you know, like, so it, you know, the bond of Catholicism might have been cost more, might have been really built more by earthquakes and typhoons and pestilence and starvation and warfare. World War II might have, you know, in the same way that 2.5 years of Japanese occupation had a way of Americanizing Chamorros more effectively than anything the Americans tried to do before the war. Right? It only took Japanese 2.5 years to make Chamorros feel like, you know what, I think I'm an American. I think I want to learn English. I think, you know, fuck that. I'm going to make money. You know what I mean? My land is going to become real estate. You know, I think you can thank the Japanese for this very strong bond. Well, I don't want to lose sight of Chamorro agency. That generation survived the fucking war and occupation period, and they knew what was good and what was bad. You know, and like, what do I know? You know, I know what the war meant to my parents, and it's like I came from an entirely different generation. You know, and but that's where Guam is too, right? New generations of Chamorros rethinking their parents and their grandparents' investments and truths and struggling to figure it out. And I think that's a good thing. And you know, let Matå'pang's canoe be a vessel for braving choppy waters where you can't really tell which direction to go or which swell that is. You know, a good navigator, a very good navigator can distinguish not only up to 6 distinct swells out there. The swells have distinct characteristics of how they roll, what they look like, how your canoe reacts to it, the wake. Some swells will displace water in a way that's different from, you know, this kind of stuff. Not only can they discern that, and when they discern it, they know direction because the waves and swells are, as they say in Polowat, are related to stars. They're relatives. You know, so that wave over there comes from that star. You stupid, can't you see? It looks very different from that wave over that swell, right? But not only can they discern up to like 6 different sets of swells, but they also know, they can read what most of us would just simply see as choppy waters, chaotic. They say, that's that swell and that swell. That's what happens when they come together, you know. And then when that is when those two are like the stars are fighting each other, and then this swell comes and joins in, you know. And we know that because our canoe is doing this, you know, and we can check that against the skies, and we can check that against the clouds, and we can check that against what we know of this place. You know, so let let Matå'pang's canoe be the place, the instrument, the site the being that that, like its namesake, might at first glance to be irreconcilable contradictions and messy entanglements and paradoxes that we need to honestly and bravely contend with, and constantly seek the knowledge and the wisdom that ancestral traditions bequeath to us for clues of how to make sense of that. So, you know, Matå'pang's Canoe Club, like intrepid, brave explorers, were fearless in confronting the most difficult issues and didn't back off, even if it could make you unpopular, right? And I'm not simply talking about questioning Americanness, but maybe distinctly Chamorro understandings of Americanness might have to be examined, or vestiges of Chamorro Catholicism, or vestiges of Chamorro patriarchy, or vestiges of Chamorro homophobia. In other words, the really tough issues that you know, generally people don't like to deal with, and nations are famous for smoothing over. National discourse is famous for smoothing over in favor of a simplistic, celebratory, rah-rah story that just sweeps under the rug. You know, that this bullshit story of America and freedom and liberty that was clearly purchased at the expense of so many people, beginning with indigenous people and slaves. But America doesn't want to deal with that, and continuously only brings that up as it serves this romanticized story of exceptionalism and freedom and liberty. But we all know that that's bullshit, right? It might be only good for a select few or the chosen few, you know, and you can join them if you disavow your positionality in it or stuff like that, you know. So something like that, you know.
Oh, I love it.
And but hey, you know, don't let me tell you what Matå'pang's Canoe Club should be.
Yeah.
Really, you know, that's really just an essay where I try to leverage, you know, I hope if people read it, even if they don't understand it, they'll see I'm not just making things up.
Yeah.
You know, in trying to take stock of Matå'pang's relationship to Matå'pang, for example, you know, I talked to Rosa, and Rosa gave a very interesting analysis of the meaning. You know, she that, and it was very interesting to compare that to what the Austronesian linguist said about Matå'pang. You know, this professor who I took a class with a long time ago. You know, and you know, shit, he came up with 3 other clearly homonyms, right? They may or may not be the same term. Good chance that they are. The question is exactly how do they relate to Chamorro discourses, you know, of Matå'pang, but what, you know, to me, it's not whether you agree with me or not. It's you know, what's more important to me is that you see that I labored to base what I saw, for better or for worse, on some evidence that is either in the historical record or in oral tradition. You know, those who would lionize Matå'pang, for example, and I'm not dismissing that. I get it. You know, are going to would have a earful from the likes of Polly Scott, you know, who was a very complicated figure, who was a formidable figure in Chamorro cultural history, and you know, he was an intellectual and stuff like that, and you know, and he had very strong, you know, the effort to canonize Salvatoris was revived by men like him, and I argued he was the one that should be responsible, or should be credited or debited, you know, for the idea of resuscitating Salvatoris. So he told me that Archbishop Flores was initially not all that interested in it, and it was Polly Scott who the credit needs to be due to the story of the revival, the effort to celebrate this Catholic priest, you know, one who himself has been vilified by secular historians who are not favorable to Spain, right? And to nationalists. But if there was anyone to credit for this seeming paradox and contradiction of a 17th century missionary being reviving, you know, the cost to canonize and being revived in the modern Guam in the 1960s and 70s. That's Chamorro priest, and then eventually got picked up, you know, and I tell a story of the naming of the church in Tumon, Blessed Diego, and the people there are people who are still praying to Salvatoris for a miracle. Don't get me started with the story of how the Filipinos managed to actually get Salvatoris' Filipino companion and server, Pedro Calongsor, actually get him canonized. I mean, think about it. You know, he was canonized by virtue of being an assistant to Salvatoris. The case that was made on his behalf was all the same materials that argued for the heroism of Salvatoris. So the case for Calongsor rode the coattails of Salvatoris, except the big difference is the Filipino kid became a saint before the Spanish Catholic priest. Like, what the fuck's that? You know, in the discourse of contemporary canonization, the step from beatification to canonization rests on a contemporary miracle, and a contemporary miracle is documented when you have chronicled and recorded instances of people praying to that person for something, and then that happens. The church will say, okay, there's evidence of a miracle there. So the Filipinos, the 20th century church in the Philippines, convinced Vatican that supplication to Pedro Calongsor was efficacious enough to convince the Vatican that, you know what, we're willing to now say that he's a saint in heaven, right? And he got that shit before Salvatore's. Like, doesn't that mean Filipino's prayer is more powerful than Chamorro prayers?
They must be, yeah.
You know,
He came out on top.
You know, you mean the boy has more pull with God than the priest?
He did something right, you know.
You know, well, of course, non-Catholics will say, "Yeah, that's the church for you," right? Yeah, but I'm not going to say that. You know.
You know, as I was reading your the chapter again last night, it's one of those readings that always like I feel like there's always little nuggets in there that I pick up on, things that I never catch the first time around. And I must have read In the Wake of Matå'pang's Canoe like at least 4 times now throughout my master's.
I wish I could write more clearly, honestly. When people say, "Man, your reading's hard, your writing is hard," I'll say, "Man, you know, I'm not trying to do that on purpose. Like,
Yeah.
I don't process these things. I mean, I'm kind of slow, you know, and I don't know how to write it clearly. So it's my cross to bear.
I think it's
really.
There's always
I was
go
a
ahead.
dumb jock. I was a football player. I went from knowing nothing to being to Foucault.
Yeah.
That will mess you up, you know, because I don't know the conventional narratives of stuff, you know, and then all of a sudden I got hyper critical lens to question all of that.
Yeah.
You know, so that's my problem, you know, and your problem if you're trying to read me, you know, but you know, that's all I can say. You know, I'm sorry.
No, I think
I'm sorry you have to read it so many times. You should see how many times I have to rewrite it.
Oh man, I'm sure there's a lot of like I'm pretty sure that happens a lot to like native scholars, I'm sure, you know, and like all of a sudden
Some
we find
people who
ourselves
read,
yeah.
I don't know, Emma's book is very clear, and it's like, oh, you make it seem so easy, you know, like I actually know, I know Terry very well. Terry was like a dear sister, you know, Terry was her mentor, and everything that Emalani is writing builds on, even if she doesn't show it, even if she, you know, she had this one line, this popular phrase, roots and routes. And I thought, no, that's not a dig at me, but I was one of the people with Terry to put that on the agenda. And I remember and still think that that's a radical thing, you know, to look at roots and routes as constitutive of what indigeneity. You can't have a deep sense of place without an expansive sense of place. These are always relational things. Things don't exist self-evidently.
Yeah.
You know, you know, and so it kind of blew my mind. When did that become so popular as to be like, she didn't even, to me, I know a genealogy of struggling to articulate indigeneity in more expansive terms. That's what we tried to do with Native Pacific cultural studies. Up until then, and trust me, I studied history and anthropology. What they were saying about Pacific history and Pacific anthropology, they were assuming they knew what indigeneity was. And those first generations of Pacific histories written were all about men and nation states. And surely that can't be the full story of indigenous past. An indigenous past may not even be about the past, you know. So, you know, I think I come from a generation of people that were taken by critical theory and and indigenous traditions to sort of mess up the conventional received truths of things, you know. And roots and routes, understanding indigeneity in terms of mobility, without positing that a moving native is inauthentic, because it used to be that, you know, if the native is not at home, then they're either not authentic anymore, or, you know, that. So, but when you understand Pacific indigeneity by virtue of a history of canoes, that can't stand. It just doesn't stand, you know.
Yeah.
So I'm not saying all natives are like this, but I am willing to assert and fight that you can't understand Pacific indigeneity without understanding mobility. But mobility doesn't mean doesn't mean you lose the specificity and particularity of place and vernacular. You know, you still have to stand that ground. But it would be a mistake to think that it's only that ground, only that that is self-contained. The idea of self-containment, that is the principal understanding of what an island is I think, a colonial fantasy.
Right.
No island was ever an island to begin with. You know what I mean? So
For sure.
seafaring, that's what seafaring has done to me, you know. So that's what I think is at stake in it. So if you ask me about Matå'pang's canoe, there's a lot of stuff going on in there, right?
Yeah.
But I'm not going to tell you how to do that. That's, you know, that's the beautiful thing about canoes, actually. Canoes are a study, a phenomenon of the relationship between consistency and variation. There's outrigger. Canoes in Oceania have outriggers, sometimes two. Sometimes those outriggers are two hulls, the double hull canoe. But that's about where the commonality ends. Across Oceania and island Southeast Asia, all the way to Madagascar, outrigger sailing technology varies in design, in the parts and all of that kind of stuff. So you have this wonderful tension between commonality and variety. You know, and it's both. You know, you've been in New Zealand long enough to, I'm sure, be sick of how Maoris and Polynesians sort of help themselves to ownership of the entire Pacific through very, very, very powerful, robust, and even problematic ideas of kinship that erases difference, you know. And you know that you've been there long enough to know how that begins among themselves. That tension is also battling it out with Pacific Islanders there, you know. So you know, I have a kinship with you, or anybody from Guam who spends considerable time in a place like New Zealand, because, you know, some of us have been around Pacific studies long enough to really feel the sting of being marginalized by Polynesian hegemony, you know, and Melanesians know that, you know. You know, I mean, but So
Yeah. No, actually, now that you mention it, a lot of the connections that I've made because of you have been with Polynesians out there who have been very receptive to Micronesians and to engaging with Micronesia, and it's just been so great.
That's one of the nice things that I'm seeing around. There's a new generation now, or a group of critical Pacific Islanders who are conscious of the way discourses about indigeneity and even connectivity to other parts of the Pacific can be very problematic, and not just in this benevolent way. Emily is one of those. Emelani's work is one of those, precisely because she was a student at Terry. And Terry was very adept at understanding the vernacular and the politics of indigeneity in so many different places in the Pacific. So it's been a pleasure reading that book. But she has a chapter on the canoe revival, especially in the Big Island where she's from, the Makali'i. But she tells a story about the Makali'i and the power of the revitalization. But there's a story she doesn't tell, and that's of the story when the Makali'i came through Micronesia and stopped off in Guam and different parts to pay tribute to Mao. And that was a whole episode that came with its share of bullshit in almost every Micronesian stop, especially in Guam. I noticed firsthand because they sent an advance team to prepare stuff in the different spots. And when they came to Guam, they asked us those of us who were involved in seafaring, they wanted to set up the ceremonies about coming in. And they specifically said they wanted to be welcomed in, that's really presumptuous, and then we said, well, what do you have in mind? And then they say, no, you do it the way you're supposed to. Okay, and then they proceeded to tell us how it's supposed to be, and because of their indebtedness to Mao, their banner, the title of the voyage was "E Mao," so it was a play on Mao, but "E Mao" also means to go forward, right? They had bringing the master home, and they carried themselves as if, we're honoring him, and why can't you all just do it? And at one point I remember saying, I'll just tell you that the canoe house that we have at the moment has kinship with canoe houses in Pulawat, not Satawal. And Mao actually has lineage to one of those canoe houses. You'll never get us saying Mao is the only master, the way you guys think, and so, and then when they came, members of that crew were so fucking arrogant and obnoxious and smug, and the sense of superiority. My students in our canoe class, even when we're bringing food to them, they were being snubbed, we're all that and you guys aren't, because we're going to Satawal and you're just Guam. It's like some of the guys that were in my class were ready to get into it with them, fuck you. Actually, you're docked here in my village. They were docked in Agate. So you watch how you talk to us, So none of that is in her kind of, really cool story about Makali'i.
Oh yeah.
And stuff and honoring Mao, And I was thinking, you know how basketry operates in the United States is the discourse of honoring natives. You know, what Kansas City Chiefs, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
but we're honoring you, fierce warriors.
Oh man.
Get that shit out of here, you know.
Yeah.
If that's honoring, stuff it, you know. So we're honoring Mao.
Mhm.
You know,
Oh man.
by calling him the only navigator left.
Yeah. Terrible.
You know,
Well, I want to thank you for your time and all your support throughout my personal journey throughout the PhD and all that. And the
well,
work
you
of
know,
Matå'pang's Canoe is instrumental in that in a way, as much as you maybe don't want to admit.
well, look,
and
I'm very cognizant that, you know, you reached out to me, you wanted to do your PhD, you asked for letters of recommendation, you do that, but we know I did really nothing in your training, you know. I didn't, in fact, you know, I may have even dropped the ball on a letter of recommendation, but maybe you knew that or maybe you didn't know that, you know.
News to me.
Honestly, I don't remember if I did or not, you know. Sometimes I'm in periods where I forget things like that, but you know, you and I know that you did your work. I didn't, you know.
Yeah.
I can't take any credit for your accomplishments, you know.
For sure.
And so total props to you, you know. So, and I'm just really stoked that you're back home and you're teaching there. I miss UOG.
Yeah.
And I think you're gonna find, you know, Keith was my student. Keith Camacho, the first class I taught when I graduated and went home in 1992. Keith Camacho just graduated from FD and was a freshman.
Wow.
And took my class. So a bond that we have is that we started at UOG together, you know, except he was a freshman and I was a freshman professor, you know.
Yeah.
And look at him now, you know, that he's doing all kinds of things, and he's still, and he, you know, so I love that. I'm not taking credit for him. I just love that I know what it's like, and I know that you're going to experience students who are taking classes at UOG because there's nothing else that they're doing, or they're with a friend. You know, I went to UOG to play football. That was my goal in life, was to play for the Tritons.
Yeah.
Nothing more, and I'm dead serious. You know, my goal first was to play for JFK, and then to play one day, possibly play for the Tritons. You know, and that gave me an opportunity to, as a walk-on at UH, and UH political science, because it sounded smart. Political science sounds smart, right?
Yeah.
Political science. Look about. So anyway, so I know what it's like. You're you know, not a lot, but there's gonna be a student who's gonna like, fuck, what's this guy saying, man? And then their heads are gonna just start going, and pretty soon,
yeah,
they're reading, and they're you know, so.
Yeah, I am enjoying having those connections with students and watching them, you know, get into it. So.
And you're gonna cry when you see them graduate.
Oh man.
You know, like a student who's like no preparation for school, for college. You know, I love that UOG is an open enrollment. You know, apply, you get in, even if you're fucking illiterate. You know, you
Yeah.
can't put a sentence together.
Mhm.
I miss that. I miss that. Those
For sure.
students, you know.
Oh man. Yeah. Hey, well, we got to do this more often, you know?
Anytime.
Yeah.
Hey, go for it. Whatever you do at Matå'pang's Canoe, uh, just make people think. You
I'll
know,
do my
think
best.
twice and all that stuff. You know, but yeah, take that canoe and you know, in the wake of Matå'pang's Canoe at Matå'pang.
Mhm. For sure. I'll do my best. All right,
Okay,
then.
man.
See you,
Right.
Mossy.
Right
Thanks.
on. Bye.